Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host Roberto Mazza, and it's with great pleasure that today my guest is Nadim Bawalsa. Nadim is a historian of modern Palestine, and he worked his PhD at New York University. But more importantly, he just wrote a book which I would say is going to change our perception of Palestine in a way that his idea of looking at transnational Palestine, which is the title of the work, allows us to get a sense of Palestinian communities abroad. And this is the reason why I really wanted to set up an interview with Nadim. So his book, Transnational Palestine, is a book about migration and the right of return before 1948. Because in fact, as Palestinian communities began to move away from late Ottoman Palestine and they settled down mostly in Latin America, they also tried to retain their citizenship after the British took over and established the mandate. But more importantly, in 1925, enabled a law which essentially took away the right of citizenship. And ever since, all of these communities, coming from Nablus, Bethlehem, Bei Jala, and indeed Jerusalem, felt more isolated, disconnected, at least from a superficial level. But indeed they kept their connections with the land of Palestine. And while the language may have shifted from Arabic to Spanish, still, the ties between Palestinians in Latin America and Palestine are stronger than ever. I can certainly not omit the fact that Nadim is Al-Shabaka's that is the Palestinian Policy Network with a great website and a very good number of podcasts, and he's the commissioning editor of the website, but he's also a freelance journalist for Jerusalem Story. Before we're going to talk about your work and your book, Nadim, welcome.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you for having me.
Nadim, the first question I want to ask is about really yourself. And so can you tell us something about your background and the origins of the book, Transnational Palestine?
Absolutely. I identify as Palestinian Jordanian. I was born in Jordan to Palestinian parents. The interesting thing is that while my father's family traces their roots back to Kerak on the east bank of the Jordan River, my grandfather did the odd thing in the early 40s of moving to Bethlehem from Kerak. He'd been working with the Arab army under the Glub Pasha's regime in Jordan, and he was assigned to work in a Bethlehem outpost. So he moved there and raised my father and his 7 siblings in Bei Jala, just beside Bethlehem. And so my father was always identified as Palestinian culturally, even though our last name comes from this side of the river. When I say this side, I am currently in Jordan. But my mom's family is sort of squarely within the sort of the Jerusalem, Ramallah intellectual elite. So, Palestine has always been part of the fabric of our household, whether my mom and dad or my grandmother, who was a big part of my upbringing, who's from the Nasser family, my mom's family, the Said family. So, sort of very aristocratic, English-educated Palestinians who suffered tremendously during 48 and then 67 and so on. So it was very much part of my upbringing in many ways. As for the origins of the book, this was part of a dissertation project that I started in 2011. I had just started my PhD at NYU in 2010, and a year later I went to the State Archives in Jerusalem to sort of do preliminary dissertation research to see what I could come up with. The initial goal or hope was to find my focus during the master's and the first year of PhD research was more autobiographical sources, so looking at diaries and journals and letters and memoirs and so on from Palestinian intellectuals in the early 20th century, like Khalil Sakakini and so on. So I wanted to go to Jerusalem to try to piece together a more robust intellectual history that wasn't necessarily religious and wasn't necessarily about nationalism. So sort of what were Palestinians thinking and saying outside of, uh, the sort of the nationalist circles. And it struck me that autobiographical sources would be the place to find that information. So I went to the state archives and I found a few, sort of letters and so on, but they really weren't saying much. And after a few weeks in the archives, and I was quite frustrated at that point because my research was coming to an end. A friend of mine who was in the PhD program with me, Frederick Mayton, who's currently at the University of New Hampshire, was also a professor of a historian of Palestine. He was also with me at the archive, and he came up to me one afternoon and said, "Nadim, could you take a look at this document? I think I understand it, but it's written in Arab, handwritten in Arabic. But I think it says 1927 at the top, and this definitely says Centro Social Palestino de Monterrey, Mexico. So the Palestinian social center of Monterrey, Mexico, 1927. So it struck us both that what is this document? Why are there Palestinians in Mexico in the 20s, and why did they form a center? And they had letterhead printed in Arabic and Spanish. And what was this document about? So it's not easy to read handwritten Arabic from 100 years ago, but I managed to decipher that it was in fact a petition written to the British government of Palestine in Arabic. It was demanding redress for the British government having denied applications of several Palestinian migrants in Mexico, denied their applications for Palestinian citizenship a few months prior to that petition. So I thought that was very interesting, and I thought, well, this is clearly a topic that's never been written about. In my years of graduate work, I'd never heard of Palestinian activists in Mexico in the 20s trying to go back to Palestine as Palestinian citizens. So the box where my friend Frederick found that document, there were several more similar documents written in Arabic, English, Spanish, and even French from Palestinians all over the Americas, including Cuba, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Chile, Honduras, of course, the United States, and the bigger hubs in South America, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. So all these Palestinians, these sort of networks of Palestinian activists were engaging in this transnational sort of political activism, demanding their rights to Palestinian citizenship from British authorities, British mandate authorities in the 20s. So this is how the book came to be a project. The project, or the top. This is how I found the topic, and this is how I moved away from that sort of intellectual history to something I thought was much more original, much more new. So in subsequent years, I went to England, and then to the British Archives in London, and then to the Biblioteca Nacional in Santiago in Chile, which had the largest number of sources related to this period, the 20s and 30s. And I managed to piece together what's really a story of a struggle to return that started in the 1920s and not 1948.
Before I move to the next question, I just want to say that your book actually struck a particular chord with myself and my work a long time before you actually started your work. When I was, looking for material related to the Nabi Musa riots of 1920, I remember bumping into boxes of this Comité de Hijos de Palestina from Mexico and other parts of Latin America petitioning and complaining about the events. And in fairness, I didn't know exactly what to make of all of those documents. I thought they were like just individuals who lived abroad and cared about their land. But other than that, I closed the boxes, and it was a pleasure to actually to understand and read your material and see that there's an entire world behind those petition and those letters. And for me, it was like a sort of a lesson learned that sometimes it's worth following through instead of just dismissing, because I feel like, who are these Palestinians writing in Spanish, right? And must be some, just a few individuals. But actually, it turns out there were a lot more. Let me ask something about the beginning and the end of your book. So, both the starts and the ends really are about personal stories. And I was wondering if you can give us a taste of them, and also how do these stories relate to your narrative?
So as I mentioned, in the first question, in terms of my own mode of identification, let's say, I've never lived in Palestine, yet I've never not identified as Palestinian, and this is really sort of the crux of the book, is that you might be a stateless national for eternity, but you will always somehow feel connected to this history, whatever it is, wherever it is. And so, well, we know exactly where it is. It's historic, geographic Palestine, but um, our inability to go there and lay claims to it, whether it's to territory, property, or a right to reside and stay, is very much connected to why we continue to identify as Palestinians. This is what I realized from all these years of research. And for most historians, how many of us get to connect with the source material so personally? So this it struck me as important to connect to this material personally and to explain to the readers why this topic was so important for me personally. And so to realize that there were Palestinians across the Americas 100 years ago who, like myself, are barred from return, but feel strongly connected to this land and this mode of identification was something very moving for me. So I decided to introduce the book that way with the prologue. I get into my childhood and what it means to have grown up in Jordan, mostly in Jordan, but we moved quite a bit, identifying as Palestinian, but carrying a Jordanian passport, living in a country that while it does recognize Palestine, and of course we're allowed to speak about it and so on, we don't really question the narrative of Jordan, Palestine, how they came to be separate being entities when they never should have been, so to speak. Um, and the fact that my last name is from this side of the river, the East Bank, meaning that makes me Jordanian and not Palestinian. So all these things sort of influenced the way I decided to frame this book and structure it from start to finish. The sort of trajectory of cementing this connection to a mode of identification that is unequivocally Palestinian, in spite of all forces around around us that tell us otherwise. That no, you are not. You are Jordanian, or no, you're not. You're an American citizen, or you're Chilean, or so on. So I started the book with that sort of anecdote, and then ended it with something that actually happened. It wasn't apocryphal, but it was one of the last times I'd gone to Jerusalem to attend an uncle's funeral in Beit Hanina, and I enter Israel on my U.S. passport, which I acquired as a teenager through my American stepfather. So that's how I go, which is another element of I can go to Palestine as a U.S. tourist on a 3-month visa. I'm not recognized as someone returning, someone from there. So that was also another level of sort of existential angst, let's say. Whenever I go as a U.S. citizen. But anyway, I was sitting at this funeral, and the woman came up to me to say, "You look very familiar. Are you Yusuf Bawalsa's son?" And I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "I was his neighbor growing up in Bei Jala, and I knew it had to be you," and so on. So anyway, I get to talking to this woman, and she asks what I'm doing. And this is in a funeral, and it's supposed to be somber and so on. And I tell her about my research and so on, and that I had just been to Chile, and she said, "Oh, my brother lives there, but I haven't been, and it's too far." It's so on. She says, she says, "But wow, there's really that many Bajalis, so residents of Bei Jala, and Talahmes, residents of Bethlehem, and Sawahre, residents of Beit Sahur, that live in Chile." And I was telling her just how sort of palpable the Palestinianness of these communities was in Chile. And there was this something really beautiful that happened in this very somber setting. And I thought, it's what a nice way to end the book, that yes, this is a sad story. And yes, we continue to live with tremendous sadness and loss when it comes to Palestine, but also when we find each other, wherever it is, whether in Palestine or the Andes, like I discovered through my research, there is this, intangible warmth that brings us great joy, I would say, and sort of and relief that, hey, at least we're not lost forever just because we don't have a state, or at least we still have ways to connect with one another and establish these transnational connections. There's also something nice about having a book that went all over the globe. Sort of, yes, Jerusalem and Palestine in the 1910s and teens when Palestinians were leaving, and then sort of the seat of the British Empire in England and what was happening there, and then all the way to Mexico and so on, and then to have the book end by coming back to Palestine was also somehow a nice way to frame and close the book, I thought. And I was worried, to be honest, to start an academic text and to start and end an academic text with personal reflections. And I thought the publishers wouldn't go with it, but in fact, they all said, "Well, this is really fresh and different. Let's take a risk and see what happens."
I think the publishers were absolutely right in suggesting that this was a refreshing starting and ending with personal story. But now let's go back to the book. And, Transnational Palestine is about Palestinian immigration to Latin America. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about who these migrants were, and more importantly, why did they choose Latin America?
Of course. So this is how I start the book. Like most books on migration and diaspora studies, it's important to situate uh, migrants' narratives within the sort of the larger political socioeconomic context. So several historians have written about the outmigration of Ottoman Arabs or Arabic speaking Ottomans or Arabic speaking Ottoman Syrians, or however you would classify them. So what we really need to stress is that the history of Palestinian migration from Palestine to the Americas or westward was never disconnected from that of the Lebanese, the Syrians, anyone else from the Eastern Mediterranean when it was undivided Greater Syria. So starting in around in the 1860s, once the first boats full of Middle Eastern migrants started setting off westward, Palestinians were always part of these outmigrations, but their numbers were always uh, less significant than those of the Lebanese and Syrians, and this is for different reasons, but mostly because the southern province of Syria was as we know, geographic Palestine was sort of less economically significant as the ports of Beirut or the bigger cities like Damascus and Aleppo. But Palestinians were nonetheless always part of these greater waves of migration. It's just about locating them in the historical record and trying to parse out when are they Syrians as Greater Syria, as residents of Greater Syria, and when do they become, how do we know that they're Palestinian in this historical narrative? So that was the big part of the book. But going back to the reasons for migration, as with migrants from the entire region, this is mostly economic and political. So towards the end of Ottoman rule in the region, so starting 1870s, 1880s until 1920 or so, 1914 with the start of the World War. The Ottoman Empire was struggling with economically and sort of keeping up with the West. This had this had serious consequences for residents of the empire who were stretched thin economically. So famine, droughts, sort of political unrest, social unrest, sectarian strife was leading to outmigration, mostly of Christians of middle, lower socioeconomic classes. So as this outmigration was taking place, the question of where to go was also an important one. So while the Lebanese and Syrians had sort of formed the first networks and the first settlement hubs in the Americas, by the time Palestinians started to migrate as well, they were connecting with these communities upon arrival, let's say in Veracruz in Mexico or Buenos Aires or Rio de Janeiro or Santiago. They were connecting with these other Arabic-speaking migrants, the Lebanese and Syrians and so on, receiving credit lines from them, and then venturing into the American Wild West or into the interior of the continents, selling essentially Holy Land items like olive wood crucifixes and mother of pearl and olive oil and so on. Where they went is really a function of how saturated those markets had already been by other Arabic-speaking migrants. So the larger hubs like Santiago and well, let's say Sao Paulo or Buenos Aires, Mexico City, were seen as more competitive, and so it wouldn't have made sense, or nor would it have been wise for a Palestinian who considered themselves well, it was mostly men in this early stage. So a Palestinian migrant who would have considered himself to be also Syrian, to go and compete with his neighbor who was from Damascus or Beirut and so on, which would harm both of them. So Cecilia Beza, who's a political scientist and has done some historical research on this period, calls this suicidal concurrence, the idea of settling where the market had been saturated by fellow compatriots who were selling similar goods and so on, would be harmful to both. So what they did was settle these hinterlands, these areas that hadn't been tapped yet, these parts of the Chilean Andes that no one thought would be marketable. So, but for these Palestinian communities who were largely from Bei Jala, Bethlehem, and Bet Sahur, these migrants arrived harrowingly across the Andes from the Argentinian side, trekked through the Andes up on mules, arrived on the other side, and found a land that looked tremendously similar to Palestine. The hills, the dry air, the very temperate climate, very similar to Palestine's. And I found this in the sources as well. Palestinians sort of speaking to each other about how attractive Chile is for Palestinians specifically, because of how much it resembles the southern Syrian coastal climate. So this is why they chose these sort of more or less developed parts of the Americas, both for geographic and topographic and climatic similarity, and also because of economic reasons. As for northern Mexico, that was another reason why they chose those sort of the northern Mexican belt of settlements from Monterrey, Saltillo, where else? My gosh, I'm forgetting the names, but anyway, across the northern northern dry desert corridor of Mexico, proximity to the U.S. border was very important for these early migrants as well. There was a sense that if they entered at Mexico, which was easier to enter than the United States at New York, if they entered at Veracruz, they would get a credit line from other Arabic-speaking migrants, enter the Mexican continent by foot, pedal, sell goods, and then hopefully get to cross into the United States through El Paso. And many did, but of course, those who didn't chose to stay, and they became quite affluent merchants. And of course, the northern sort of terrain of Mexico is the one that would be most similar to that of the region, having a dry climate, a desert with highlands as well. So this is the story of the sort of the migration patterns of settlement and the reasons for leaving. The other reason for leaving, just to go back to one of the other push factors that drove so many to leave, was the Ottoman conscription of non-Muslims into the Ottoman army on the eve of the First World War. So this is why we see such a huge number of Christians from these provinces of Greater Syria migrating westward, fleeing Ottoman conscription.
Let me pick up from what you were just talking about, these migrants. So here you have Jerusalemites, migrants from Bei Jala, Bethlehem, and other villages and towns of Palestine. How did these migrants settle down in their new homes? And also, can you tell us a little bit more about how they experienced the changes that were occurring in Palestine from, let's say, the outbreak of World War One, but also then to the end of the war, the arrival of the British, the French, which eventually introduced new borders, legal systems, and essentially redesign the regions that belong to the Ottoman Empire into new nation states?
So I think I answered the first question a little bit earlier, but I'll give a little bit more detail about using the newspapers that I found. So in terms of how these migrants settled in their new homes, for the most part, most of them came quite poor or quite with little to their names. So what they did was either stay with relatives or friends they would meet on the boats, or middlemen they would meet at the ports who would connect them with other Middle Eastern migrant communities across the continent. So either they would stay for a period of time with them, get established, get on their feet, and then rent a space from which to sell goods and to live. So this is something that the Chilean authorities and Chilean shop owners who were not Middle Eastern, so let's say non-Middle Eastern Chilean merchants, would complain about frequently, saying that these turcos, so most all migrants from Middle East were referred to pejoratively as turcos because they carried Ottoman travel documents. So it was used as a slur against them by non-Middle Eastern migrants. They would complain to Chilean authorities that these turcos are staying open really late, and they're staying open on the weekends, which is very improper, given that Sunday is the day of the Lord, for example, or that it's improper and inconsiderate to stay open late because it has a competitive, hostile approach to being neighbors. So if you keep your shop open late, whereas your neighbor shuts at sundown, you're seen as trying to gain the upper hand. So amongst one another, these Palestinians and these migrant communities would sort of reprimand each other in the newspapers, saying, I know you live in the back of the shop, and I know you can stay open all night, but for God's sake, please stop. You can't do this anymore. You're embarrassing us. The authorities are going to shut you down. We're going to be considered low-class migrants, and we want to be considered higher-class migrants. We want to give them a reason to keep us here, so let's respect their traditions. Let's close on Sundays. Let's close early, and so on. So you get the sense for how they lived, which is in many ways how Palestinians in Palestine lived, sort of merchants and carpenters and so on. So they lived in the backs of their shops, and before long they had amassed enough wealth to open bigger shops and then factories, and then they sort of tapped into these. Actually, they quite literally dominated these larger economic fields, especially in Chile: industry, banking, manufacturing. So to this day, Palestinians form some of the wealthiest members of Chile's sort of elite society. But yeah, they all had very, very humble beginnings in terms of their homes. In terms of the other big question, which is really the book, is what happens after World War One. And to put it simply, Britain had very different plans for its mandate in Palestine, as we know, than it did for its mandate in Iraq, or than the French had in mind for Syria and Lebanon. So what we see that's radically different happening, what we see happening for Palestinians versus their Lebanese or Syrian migrant neighbors, is that these Palestinians were not allowed to lay any claim to inheritance, to residency, to property back in Palestine. Whereas French and Syrian migrants, by the time the French mandate was installed in Lebanon and Syria, were excited to have these sort of westernized, wealthier would-be residents of Lebanon and Syria acquire French citizenship, so that they can then be encouraged to come back and invest in the country, which would, of course, be beneficial to the French mandate. So it became quite clear that, in terms of what kind of citizen subject the British and the French wanted for their mandates, they both wanted the same thing. They both wanted an ideal citizen subject, and for Britain, they had that citizen subject set, and that citizen subject was the Jewish immigrant, not one of the 40,000 or so Palestinian migrants who lived across the Americas. So what this did was including the partition of Greater Syria into different territories. What this did was sort of encourage separation or division in identification among these communities in the diaspora. So they couldn't simply refer to themselves as Syrians anymore, or Arabs. You had to specify in this time period, this very volatile, shifting time period in the 20s, whether you were from what is now Palestine, Lebanon, or Syria. And what's interesting here is also that you see British officials, when denying Palestinian immigrants petition or applications for citizenship, saying, well, this person can only present Ottoman travel documents. They cannot present a birth certificate saying they were born in Palestine. The birth certificate just says, Ottoman Syria. So how do we know where they were born, for example? So they have no claim to being Palestinian, even if they say they're from Jerusalem or Bethlehem or so on. So it became really about pinpointing in the naming where you were from in order to prove that. But of course, this was only made this hard for Palestinians. The Lebanese and Syrians had much less difficulty. And Stacey Farenthold wrote about this in her book about this same time period. Syrians, of course, were seen as more troublemakers, let's say nationalists, than the Lebanese. So they had a bit of a harder vetting process to get French Syrian citizenship versus the Lebanese. But it was really the Palestinians who had the hardest time securing a legal claim to Palestine during this period.
I want to pick up on this one, even though I really wanted to ask you something about letters and petition. But since you start talking about the Palestinian Citizenship Ordinance of 1925 and the question that started earlier in 1923 with the Treaty of Lausanne, which essentially ended World War I, and so Ottoman citizenship ceased to exist. I'm curious about something, because in the book you make an argument saying that essentially 1925 is a precursor of 1948 in terms of diaspora and dispossession. And so I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on this idea.
So what this book argues is that the British mandate and British authorities, with the tacit support and approval of the League of Nations, were able to permanently exclude or permanently exile Palestinian migrants from Palestine through this Citizenship Ordinance. So what the Palestinian Citizenship Ordinance, a 1925 ordinance, does is give a way for would-be subjects of the British mandate a way to become legally part of this mandate. Who qualifies for it, even if the Treaty of Lausanne says that any migrant or any person born on this land but residing abroad has a right to it, there is still a stipulation in the Treaty of Lausanne that it's subject to the consent of the government operating on that land. So giving the British Crown, not the League of Nations, even though the League of Nations should be administering the mandates, giving the King of England, of the United Kingdom at the time, absolute authority, absolute final say on who does and does not get approved for the citizenship. This, in many ways, mirrors what happens in 48. In some senses, in the Israeli right of return, the law of return, and the subsequent nationality laws promulgated over the last 70-something years. What the Israelis do upon creating the citizenship laws, the nationality laws in 1950 and 1952, they reset citizenship, essentially making obsolete any documents prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. So had any Palestinians who were exiled in 48 held British Palestinian passports, those were no longer recognized under the new state. This is very similar to what the British did. So the British, even if the Palestinian who had left Palestine as an Ottoman citizen and had that travel document, even if they could present that to the British consulate in Santiago or in Monterrey or in Mexico City and say, here's evidence that I am from that land, that I am protected, my nationality is protected under the Treaty of Lausanne, that government or that consulate there was no precedent, there was no way to ensure that that government or that consular officer would need to approve the application, even though the law said that every person had the right. Similarly, as we all know, we all have a right to return as exiled Palestinians. But what does that mean what power weight does that have in the face of a governing body, a regime that doesn't want to recognize your right of return, or that has final say in who does and doesn't get to belong to this land, which really throws a wrench in international law and what value does international law have against regimes of power that can wield power however they choose, irrespective of stipulations in different treaties. Whether it's UN resolutions protecting the rights of refugees in refugee camps across the region, whether it's the Treaty of Lausanne, whether it's the League of Nations itself, the text of the League of Nations, the Covenant of the League of Nations, what exactly is there in international law to ensure that certain regimes of power will abide by it? And this is really why I find 1925 so interesting, because there is precedent for exiling and keeping in exile tens of thousands of Palestinians by the time 1948 comes around and the Zionists establish the state that they have.
Let me go back to what I wanted to ask you about, sort of a major topic discussed in your book, which is petitions and committees. And so I was wondering how these Palestinian migrants, form committees and send letters and petitions to mostly European authorities. Can you tell us something about the process, how these committees were formed, petitions written, and who are the people involved?
Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to find much information on how these organizations or these cultural clubs and these committees came to be, but all formed in the 20s. That's an important fact, meaning upon the ratification of mandates by the League of Nations in 1921, we see a flurry of activity in the Mahjar, in the diaspora, of all these different committees popping up with the clear intention of remaining connected to what's happening in the homeland, meaning if, for example, there were conflicting interests between Druze and Maronite communities in Lebanon about the best course of action following the demise of the Ottomans, Maronites and Druze communities in Michigan wanted in on this discussion. So they would form, the Druze, this is an example and possibly incorrect, but there was a proliferation or a mirroring of nationalist mobilization and, let's say, political activism from the homeland in the Mahjar, in the diaspora. So if there were, like, for example, and it's bidirectional. So if in the Mahjar they are creating committees and organizations to protect the rights of Palestinian communities, they're also forming these organizations and these groups in Palestine. Certainly not across the board, but the more significant ones, yes. So what we see occurring in the early 20s in Mexico and Chile especially is the formation of these Palestinian committees, these Comité Hijos de Palestina, Centro Social Palestino, Club Sirio Palestino, Club Syrian Palestinian Youth Club, which was a very important one in Santiago. 1922, 1924, the Club Deportivo Palestino was formed in 1920, the famous football club in Chile today. So these groups popping up in response to Balfour Declaration, essentially, Britain's clear plan to hand over Palestine to the Zionists. In response, these groups forming in defense of Palestine. What's interesting is that we see a lot of Sirio Palestino meaning that we know Damascus to have been the hub of Syrian Arab nationalism around the Treaty of Versailles, having sent a delegation to Versailles representing all residents of Greater Syria. This connection between Syria and Palestine, even though for these migrants themselves, these were not mutually exclusive categories. You could be Palestinian and Syrian because you form the southern region of Syria. But in direct response to the British authorities, for example, saying you're either Syrian or you're Palestinian, you can't be both. This as a result of the partition of Greater Syria into mandates. So you see this flurry of groups popping up across the diaspora. Their only way of communicating, their only legal, let's say, legitimate and an accepted way of communicating with their distant overlords, being the British and French mandate authorities, was through petitions. That was the only way they could make demands and so on. But petitions themselves, I mean, Susan Peterson and Natasha Wheatley have written extensively about the petitioning process throughout the League of Nations years. Petitioning was a very specific process. I mean, if your petition was to be considered by a consular officer in Mexico City or in Santiago or in Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo, you really had to have done your research. You had to have found a translator. You had to have received a certain number of signatures. You had to have sort of couched the language in this very respectable rhetoric. You can't speak to your the High Commissioner for Palestine you can't express yourself freely. You have to show deference and respect to this authority. So what you find in the petitions is this tension, really, where the petitioners have to show respect for this ruler. They have to show not just respect but gratitude for having liberated Palestine from the Ottomans and having given them their freedom. But they're also here to tell you, we are watching you. We know that you are contravening international law. You are abusing your power. We demand redress. If you don't, if you don't afford us our rights, we will go to the League of Nations. I mean, these little threats, these sort of excuse me, subversive petitions are really sort of what's so exciting about these documents. For them to have made it to Jerusalem and made it to Geneva and made it to London means means two things. Means that they were written quite well. It also means that the consular offices in these different migrant hubs were moved by what they were hearing. And in fact, it turns out that yes. So in some newspapers, in some communications between migrant communities across the Americas, they would recommend to each other which consular officer to go to visit because they were sympathetic with our cause, right? So it wasn't that the entire British establishment was out to keep these Palestinians from returning. It was that the High Commissioner certainly and certain members of the British sort of colonial enterprise had something in mind for Palestine, and there was no room for these migrants, even if they had a valid reason to petition and protest. So that's why petitions are so interesting, is that they're couched in the language of international law. They're completely appropriate documents. They're not revolutionary. They're not saying get out of our land. They're not saying give us back. They're part and parcel of the structures of League of Nations, and which includes the mandates. And that actually is, in many ways, why it was so easy for the British mandate to just simply ignore them, because petitions could easily be dismissed. There was no reason for British or French authorities to be intimidated by petitions. They were simply a way for these mandated colonized subjects, a way for them to communicate with their colonizers. But read in a certain way, we can see them as modes of group and national development. I mean, the fact that these groups of Palestinians are coming together, collecting signatures, drafting these letters, traveling to Mexico City from Monterrey or from Illapel in 300 kilometers north of Santiago, all the way to Santiago, down the slopes of the Andes to deliver these petitions, means that something was happening socially amongst these groups of people, these 300 plus people per petition, for them to feel connected and vindicated enough that this is a justice we must pursue, and we will do it no matter what. So this had to have repercussions on the community in terms of self-fashioning, self-identification, and so on. And that's really how it goes from a history of Syrian migration to a history or Syrian Ottoman or an Arab migration to a history of Palestinian diaspora formation in the context of the interwar international law.
I was just wondering about something when you were talking about it, that a lot of historians would call this period, and probably myself too, the Wilsonian moment. But actually, we should probably rename it the petition moment, because if I think about the amount of petitions Palestinians and Syrians and Lebanese wrote, for instance, when the King Crane Commission visited the Middle East, it's massive, and they all followed certain rules and language. They were absolutely convinced that this petition might have changed their situation. It didn't, but if anything else,
Yeah.
it tells us about the feelings and about how people saw themselves and understood the international construct of that period in time.
Exactly.
I have a question about chapter 4 and chapter 5 of your book. In this chapter, you're talking about Palestinians, particularly in Mexico and Chile. And so I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about these communities and how their experience was similar and different, and how they related to each other and obviously to Palestine. Perhaps also you can tell us something more about the famous football club, Club Palestino, better saying, that is based in Chile, given that we are in the time and moment of a football World Cup played in Qatar at the moment.
I'll do my best to speak to the Club Deportivo Palestino, but as a historian, I'm mostly stuck in the past. But if we're to compare Mexico and Chile in terms of settlement, I in fact, Honduras per capita has the highest number of Palestinian migrants relative, per capita. But Chile today has the largest number of Palestinians outside of the Middle East. Mexico has a very large number of Palestinians, but tracing them out of, or sort of weeding them out of the larger Lebanese or Syrian migrant communities in Mexico is harder. This is mostly because the more successful communities to have settled Mexico and established themselves as Middle Eastern migrant communities were the Lebanese, much like in Brazil and Argentina. Or Argentina, it's the Syrians. Of Lily Balafit's book, Argentina and the Global Middle East, I believe is the title, is an excellent example of just how influential Syrian communities from Halab, from Aleppo, from Damascus, and so on, were in establishing themselves in Argentina. Similar books have been written for the Lebanese, certainly, and it's high time similar books are written for the Palestinians. And this is why Chile is a particularly interesting example, because like in Mexico, the Palestinian communities in Chile managed to emerge the most sort of influential and powerful economically and politically. Why in Chile and why not in Mexico? Well, really, this goes back to settlement patterns, and what we see is that let's say a migrant from Bei Jala or Bethlehem arrived in Santiago in 1890, established a small shop, went back and forth to Palestine for decades up until World War One. Brought back neighbors, married, had children, so on. Endogamy was the way of doing things. So you went back to your community, you found someone either from your village, your town, or from within your religious sect, and you brought them back with you. This was similar across most of the Middle East. So it's happenstance. It's really simply coincidence that, there's also topographic similarity between Chile and Palestine, and what we talked about earlier, economic wanting to avoid economic competition. So the Lebanese had already settled, let's say, certain parts of Mexico. Then the Palestinians will not go there. They will go maybe further north to Monterrey and Saltillo, markets that haven't been tapped. And subsequently, their relatives will start moving there as well. So then you have these Palestinian Mexican communities emerging and so on. But of course, in terms of discussing these migrant and settlement patterns, the only reason we speak about them different as parsed out internationalities is because of the mandates. This wouldn't have been necessary had 100 years ago, had these mandates not formed and then forced these demarcations. In terms of Mexico and settlement in Mexico, I would recommend audience to read Teresa Alfaro Velkamp's book "So Far from God, So Close to Heaven," and Camila Pastor de Maria y Campos' book on Lebanese migrant communities in Mexico during the mandate period. I hope I got the titles right. But in any case, these books really delve into these settlement patterns for these communities, mostly for the Syrians and Lebanese. The Palestinians had similar narratives, of course, in terms of arriving, connecting with other Arabic-speaking migrants, receiving credit lines, peddling goods and selling them all across the continent. For Palestinians, this occurred in the northern parts of Mexico. In Chile, this was also a very similar pattern of migration, but of course, Chile is a very vertical country. So what you see for Palestinian communities outside of Santiago and Valparaiso, the two hubs of Chilean commerce and settlement in this early period, is that they form a line from villages in the mid-Andes, such as Illapel and Ovalle, all the way down to Concepcion and Los Angeles. Also, so sort of between 400 and 500 kilometers on either side of Santiago. You also have some Palestinian communities that pop up in the Atacama Desert, which I found out through the research. They're really all over, but the hubs are those places where either the climate is suitable, it is safe politically. There's less competition and more opportunities for assimilation economically and culturally in where they are. The Club Deportivo Palestino was formed in Santiago in 1920 by Palestinian migrants. That's, in fact, as much as I know about the team. But today it is one of Chile's most prestigious football clubs. And one of the things that they tend to be very proud of is the fact that any number one on a jersey is in the shape of historic Palestine. And of course, this has caused a lot of issues, both with the Jewish community in Chile and also with larger football federations. But the Club Deportivo Palestino, there's also the Club Social Palestino, also in Santiago. I went there and I attended cultural events there. You enter that space and it's really a hub for all these descendants of Palestinians to come and eat and dance and swim and have their kids play football and run around in gardens and playgrounds and so on. It felt like I was at the Orthodox Club here in Amman, which has a similar sort of vibe about it. It's certain families from Amman that love to go there in the summers and enjoy each other's company and enjoy a drink and enjoy watching their kids play and so on. So these are very much sort of mirrored realities across the Atlantic and across these continents. And of course, there are similar Lebanese clubs, Syrian clubs. In fact, in the 1920s, there was a Homsi club and a Halabi club that emerged in Santiago. Again, at the time, this wasn't about necessarily patriotism and nationalism, Halabi versus Homsi. No, it was the fact that if you are from Halab, here's a club you could join to incentivize you to, let's say, send money. This was a big reason. Remittances were huge, were a huge mainstay of Middle Eastern economies in this time. So remittances from migrants making it big in the Americas. If you're just going to send money to Syria, how do you know it's going to go to Homs? How do you know it's going to go to Jerusalem? How do you know it's going to go to Bei Jala? So these groups would pop up to represent these different, sort of places back home. So that's what I found to be interesting about settlement patterns and how they remained connected to Palestine, promoting Palestinian issues and so on. One other thing I found really interesting was the 1927, I believe, earthquake in Palestine. Was it 1927? This rallied Palestinians in the diaspora significantly. The newspapers were just going crazy with this news. We have to send money. We have to send money. And here's this organization sending this amount. And here's this other one sending this amount. It was all going to Palestine. It was all going to different communities in Palestine. But the number of groups that popped up in the diaspora, send money to Bethlehem, send money to Bei Jala, here's one to Ramallah, here's one to Nablus, here's one, was very interesting.
I have a couple more questions, and one is very much about sort of the last chapters of the book. And I want to pick up on what you talked about earlier about periodical journals and magazines, which are, very important materials for us historians, but also, for people to spread information and obviously to sort of create their own opinions and shape their views of the world around them. You talk about this fascinating relationship of these magazines and periodicals produced in Latin America and their relationship with Palestine, the famous newspaper published in Palestine. And so I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this relationship and how Palestine essentially picked up information about, these communities abroad and talked about them in Palestine, and vice versa, how Palestine essentially produced material that was then picked up by communities abroad, and this information was spread throughout Latin America.
Certainly. Well, as you mentioned, it's a bidirectional phenomenon. So on the one hand, Philistine was one of the most prominent publications coming out of Palestine at the time, and they were the ones who, and its editors were the ones that had the most international reach, let's say. So periodicals across the Americas, also in North America as well, were receiving a lot of the news from Philistine. So, this is very common across diaspora presses is to republish pieces that are relevant pieces that appeared in publications back home. So Philistine was the major one for many publications in Chile, at least, the magazine, the periodicals that I examined. So you'd see a lot of republications of pieces that emerged, or that were first emerged in Philistine, and they would mention that certainly at the top of each article. This is a reprint of a piece that appeared on this date in Philistine. That was common, and it had sort of logical reasons to keep readers in Chile and Latin America up to date on what's happening in the homeland. Now, of course, politically, these newspapers were also very much aligned. They were nationalistic. They were all about liberating, or not liberating it, but at least giving Palestinians their self-determination. And they were secular, very importantly, which Philistine was as well. What's interesting about why Philistine newspaper would choose to republish certain pieces from diaspora presses was very political and deliberate. And as we know, Philistine was very critical of the famous nationalist parties and the sort of tribal affiliations of Palestinian nationalists in the 20s and 30s. So let's say the Husseinis and the Shashibis and these sort of bigger families, and how important it was to move past these old regime politics in order to withstand Zionist and British oppression and sort of the quashing of the Palestinian nationalist movement. So if Philistine Newspaper wants to publish a piece to critique Palestinian leadership, which they did all the time, what better way to build an argument against, or build an argument for the need to reform the nationalist movement in Palestine? Why not publish pieces that are from Palestinians in Santiago and Mexico and so on, calling for the same thing, to sort of pressure and to push this movement forward? So we see this often in Philistine newspaper in the 20s, saying, here's a migrant from Salvador who cannot come back because of the British law, but he's writing this piece and we're republishing it because he wants you to know that while he's devastated that he can't come back because of the British citizenship law, he's more devastated about the state of the nationalist movement in Palestine. This certainly a little sensationalist, but really interesting that Philistine newspaper that had a very specific agenda was finding sort of food or fodder for its mission all the way in Santiago and Monterrey and elsewhere in the Americas, to pressure nationalist leaders in Palestine to reform, to do away with old regime politics. So I think it was mutually beneficial for these different publishers, or excuse me, these different periodicals. Of course, they were selective in what they would print and reprint. Interestingly, also, something that Philistine did often was reprint the names of those who donated or sent remittances. In order, of course, Palestinian communities are quite small at the time. So for each side, let's say, for Palestinians in Palestine and Palestinians in Chile to know that, they are being named, their contributions to the earthquake relief fund or to the nationalist movement or to this organization or that is being recognized in this important piece. So it's very important for them to name one another, which also goes to show just how sort of small these networks were, and how important endogamy was to these communities. Khalas, you're from this family, this family, you're from this village, you're from this village. We honor you, and we recognize your sacrifice and your contribution, and so on. So, newspapers were very much a way for them to build these transnational networks and strengthen camaraderie.
Lastly, what happened to Palestinians in the diaspora?
All of us?
Oh, that would be another book, probably.
Yeah. Let's see. So, what's interesting is really depends where you look for them. Chile. It's funny that Chile continues to be the place where you turn to talk about Palestinian diaspora in the Americas, because it does have such a large number of Palestinians. But that's not the only reason, I think. I can't say much of what happened to Palestinians outside of Chile in terms of their historical trajectory over the 20th and 21st centuries, because many of their narratives, as I mentioned earlier, have been sort of muddled or subsumed in just they're khalas, they're Turcos, or they're all Syrios, or they're from the Middle East. And I'm meeting Palestinians in Chile, many of them would tell me that for them, remembering where they were from and maintaining and being deliberate and explicit about which town or which village they were from is very important for them, unlike their counterparts in different parts of the Americas who don't know what village or town they're from. So there was something about Chile, about the community in Chile, that kept them very attached to their specific roots, whether they're from this village or that, this family or that, So being in Chile specifically, not unlike Mexico, felt very much like being in Palestine. It's true, and I think this has a lot to do with the history of Palestine of the 20th century and what was happening. So if we have a community a community in the Americas, in Santiago, that has a large number of Palestinians, and if this community is continually, let's say, engaged in remaining connected to what's happening in Palestine, then certainly this community over the course of the 20th century and all the very dramatic events that happened in Palestine is going to continue to remain strongly attached to its Palestinian identity, versus other contexts where, let's say, education levels were not as high, where numbers of Palestinians were dwindling rather than increasing as they were in Chile. The other thing is that after 48 and 67, there were large numbers of Palestinians who also went to Chile. Chile was generally very welcoming of Palestinian refugees. So this constant flow of Palestinians and their constant growth within Chile really has a lot to do with why today, when you go to Chile and you spend time with Palestinians there, you feel very much that this is Palestine, or this is a very viable, strong Palestinian community outside or in exile. The other reason is that for the most part, they are quite successful and quite affluent, and they have managed to be part of, let's say, sort of any upper echelon of society, whether political or economic or cultural. So there are very loud and proud Palestinian cultural events being held in Santiago. There are members of parliament that are proudly identify as Palestinian. The president today, the new president, is not of Palestinian descent, but is outspoken about support for the Palestinian cause. These things wouldn't be possible in other regions or other parts of the region where, let's say, the Palestinians were a minority or were less politically, economically active. The other reality about Chile is that Chile is home to a lot of different political and cultural and ideological possibilities. It's a very diverse society politically, and we see with the recent referendum how close it was to really overturning the tide in Chile, moving to leftism. But alas, the idea is that Palestinians in Chile have always had a stake in what happens in Chile. They've never not been part of the national fabric of Chile, which has allowed them to be proud Palestinos Chilenos, rather than just Chilenos, which you find in many other parts of the Americas.
This was Nadim Bawalsa, author of Transnational Palestine, Migration and the Right of Return Before 1948, published by Stanford University Press in 2022. Nadim, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.